My name is Tom Long, and I am a Presbyterian USA minister, now retired. And I taught preaching in several seminaries for over 40 years, most recently at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta. We're thinking about the practice in the Christian faith called go tell, which is putting our faith into words, speaking to other people about our faith. There's a kind of an amusing story in the book of Acts about a great preacher named Apollos. He was described as very eloquent and very passionate, fiery even, very knowledgeable. But he had one thing wrong. He thought that the gospel was about John the Baptist. And so a missionary couple named Priscilla and Aquila had to pull him aside after they heard him preach to say, it's really about Jesus, not about John the Baptist. Well, I feel for Apollos because I think that all of us can get caught up in misunderstanding the Christian story. And one thing that's important in the practice of go tell is to tell the right story, tell the true story, tell the Christian story. I think that may be especially hard in America, where Christianity is so entrenched in the culture that sometimes the boundaries between the Christian story and other stories get blurred. I had a colleague once who had done a lot of teaching in India, and India, of course, the major religion there is Hinduism. And he said it was always inspiring to him whenever a Christian family would do something like put a manger, a nativity scene in their yard at Christmas time, because it meant something in that culture, because the Christian story was different from the predominant story that others were telling. And I think for those of us in America, we have to be very careful not to accidentally tell the cultural story rather than the Christian story. My favorite baseball team, the Atlanta Braves, every Sunday at the seventh inning stretch, they have a soloist sing God Bless America. And they will often have military jets fly over right at that point. And it's a lovely song and it's usually well sung, but it always concerns me that it's so easy to confuse the Christian story with the story of our nation, with a kind of nationalistic pride. And that's just one of the confusing options for Christians as we try to keep straight the story that we're going to tell. We all need a Priscilla and Aquila to pull us aside and say, you almost got it right, but let's straighten it out just a little bit. But one of the other stories that I think Christians sometimes tell that's a confusion of the Christian story is the story of what might be called self-help. That the purpose of the Christian faith is to make you improve in terms of your self-confidence or self-esteem, or to improve your social standing in life, kind of a Christian form of etiquette. But the Christian story is a whole lot more radical than that. It's not simply about my personal achievement or fulfillment. Here's another confusion that sometimes happens. I was reading a book by two pastors of a very large church in California, and they were tremendously successful. They had a huge sanctuary and were adding young families all the time. But the pastoral staff found themselves exhausted, and they weren't sure why. So they went on retreat. And they did some Bible study, and they did also some study of a book about church life. And in that study, like a light going on, they had a sudden discovery. They realized that in a consumerist culture, they had been preaching and teaching a consumerist form of Christianity. We've got the best church. We've got the hottest youth group. We've got the most wonderful choir. Be a part of this church. And just like we've got the best television, we've got the best refrigerator. We live in the best neighborhood. So a kind of achievement-oriented consumerism can substitute itself for the gospel. In the earliest church, when a Christian was baptized, it was often on the night before Easter. And the baptism would take place not in the church building, but in a baptistry outside of the church building. And what would happen is that the candidates for baptism would be invited to turn toward the west. And they would be invited to renounce their previous lives, the world of Satan. I no longer believe your stories anymore. And then they would be invited to turn east, to orient themselves, literally, and would be invited to claim the story of Jesus Christ as their own. And then they would take off their clothes and naked would go into the waters of baptism and come out on the other side and be given a new garment, the garment of Christ, and would be taken into the church for their first Lord's Supper. This was a change of citizenship, a change of loyalty, a change of identity. This is now my story. This is my song, not the old story. So keeping the story straight about Jesus is important in the practice of Go Tell.